All right, here we go with Chapter 2, Principles of Film Form. This changes the perspective a little bit, but not much. Here's the definition of content and form. Content is the subject of an artwork, what it is all about, and form is a means by which the subject is expressed or experienced. So if you think back in your concept of art or what images mean, we can look at a sculpture and say that's pretty straightforward, that we understand it's a man, and the meaning will be our own interpretation, but it's pretty traditional or unique, as in that we can understand what we're looking at. But this would be more abstract, have a different form or to reflect the content of a man walking, and then a more conventional approach, more modern, in that it's more of a different image of the sculpture, which creates a different meaning by how we interpret it. So form and content, we know that they're all sculptures, but that they reflect it in a different form. Now, film form is very organized. They work on it for quite a while, scripting everything out, mapping out what shots they need, special effects, anything that would create a challenge for them. They need that film form concept before they go out and actually videotape or digital tape or film that segment. So the synthesis of elemental systems. We want to look at mise-en-scène, which will be its own chapter, sound, narrative, editing, and any other elements that were introduced as we watch the film. So here are some basics. The elemental systems, mise-en-scène, is the visual design elements of a movie. It goes beyond the image. It includes sound, lighting, everything within that frame. Sound is the dialogue, music, ambience, and effect tracks put into a film. So dialogue may be recorded on the location or inserted later. Music is what you hear in the background at different times. Ambiance would be actually natural sounds that you expect to hear, but they may be added at a different time. And then effect tracks would be those special effects sounds that help carry the meaning of the scene. Narrative is the story structure, usually in a fiction form. They can mix real time in with that, in other words, reality that we've experienced, and sell the idea of the fictional moment. So they establish the characters, they establish the story, they develop it, and then they have resolution at the end, depending on the conflicts that we've encountered. And then editing, and remember this word, juxtaposition, the juxtaposition of individual shots to create a sequence, scenes, an entire movie. Shots, the product of one uninterrupted run of the camera. We talked about that in Chapter 1. Sequences is a series of shots that unify a meaning that relates to the theme or the purpose of the film. And then scenes are a complete unit. They jump from scene to create the final product. Form and expectations. Narrative form is the arrangement of a story, how they create the flow. They need a certain actions and outcomes for you to keep moving with the story. If they jumbled it all up, it would be very confusing and they'd lose that narrative form. So they're trying to create a sequence through an arrangement of events to make the story come to life. There's also our expectations of what the story will be from what we've been exposed to before we go to the film, or knowing some background of the story itself. And then other film elements will work with those formal elements to generate patterns. We accept the patterns and therefore go for the meaning of the film. So let's look at this shot. This is from The Searchers, 1956. John Ford directs with Jeffrey Hunter and John Wayne. The two have a conflict, and the positioning of this shot shows the main subject right in the center of the film, which is Natalie Wood's role, where she is the niece, and these are the uncles, their relatives, a cousin. They're going after her to rescue her from being subjected to a brutal lifestyle by a renegade band of Indians. So right away we have stereotyping. We've got two images. One is at a lower level. Then we've got the threat of the weapon. So all of these are telling us a story that you'd experience in the film. John Wayne's character wants to kill her to put her out of her misery. Jeffrey Hunter's character wants to save her and welcome her back into the family. And in the end, you find out the resolution of that conflict. But this shot is an example of mise-en-scène without the sound, but a very natural lighting. Ambient sound would be what you'd hear in this atmosphere. So it all tells you part of the story in a film form. We instinctively search for these patterns based on our lifestyle and what we've experienced in art. And the patterns that develop, we either accept or grow from, depending on how the film is told through the narrative patterns. So that's the meaning of narrative patterns. In non-narrative patterns, it conveys a character's state of mind. We have to interpret what that person feels like. So John Wayne's character wants to end the misery, while Jeffrey Hunter's character wants to welcome her back into a loving family. So that's the creation of a relationship, and you can have conflict depending on the relationship by characters. So there's a commutative narrative meaning to what you're experiencing. First, the visual, the shot patterns, how they're put together. The sounds that are used to what they call a motif. And that's basically the connecting of all the sounds and mixing of the sounds to create that feeling they want. And then repetition of a familiar image. If it's a Western, a familiar image could be the hat, the dress that they're wearing, how the costumes are coordinated, something familiar that relates to that genre. So the repetition of that will create meaning for that image that we get. So we're going to look at some different meanings and give you some perspective on that. First, remember that the key ingredient to any movie is light. Lack of light or too much light, but light drives the image. And it helps create an illusion of movement because the light strength will add to that movement. And movies manipulate space and time to create the message. Sometimes they'll do a flashback, sometimes they do a flash forward, along with what you anticipate is occurring in a space at a particular time, not in the future. So it's all a mixture. So here's one great example. Grapes of Wrath from 1940. Henry Fonda is Tom Joad, John Carradine is Jim Casey, and Muley is John Quaylen, and it's about the Dust Bowl years in the United States where farmers were, and ranchers, but basically farmers were driven off their land by the drought and by being foreclosed. They were forced to, as families, to migrate and work in a migrant atmosphere rather than owning their farm. So the poor are brutalized by those in power, the bankers, the landowners, and that type of thing. So let's look at this mise-en-scène element. Dark images because of the Dust Bowl. The light is very harsh, making you think it comes from the candle, even though it's controlled by other light elements. Muley's in the middle, Tom Joad's there, Jim Casey's there. They form a triangle so you can center in on the main message from Muley. There's Henry Fonda or Tom Joad. The harsh light from the candle creates a different look to him with darkness surrounding him, helping center on the message. They do a flashback where Muley tells him how he was driven off his land. The shadow, the light coming from that direction helps set up the meaning of him losing his land. All of it relates to a combination of elements to create a meaning. So here are some key terms, and the one I want you to remember for sure is persistence of vision, because this is how the human brain retains the image for a fraction of a second longer than the eye records it and creates motion. So our mind will latch on to that image, and since it's in film, we'll create that motion by how they're presenting it. So it means that even though a movement may be stopped, our brain retains that image for just a fraction of a second longer and creates movement. The phi phenomenon is the illusion of movement created by events that succeed each other rapidly. So we will get an image of movement that might, let's say, it's a threat against someone. And by that movement, we may not actually see an act of violence, but that illusion creates the meaning and we accept it even though we might not witness it. Then critical flicker fusion occurs when a single light flickers on and off with such speed that the individual pulses of the light create an illusion of a different form of movement. Man, maybe sporadic, but it's the illusion of light being continuous because of the amount of times it flickers. If you've ever seen The Matrix, you've seen how they create the special effects where they're almost floating, moving in an unbelievable walks on walls, ceilings, things like that. This is how they did it, by creating the illusion through individual cameras mounted all along here, each taking its own shots within a certain space of time and frequency. And from all those elements, they were able to create the movement that you see in the movie. And notice the green effect. And this is the special layering they can do from the green use. And they eliminate the green, and therefore it seems like they're floating, even though there might be naturally held by a rope or some contraption to help with the movement. Manipulation of space and time. It's common to believe that movies are based on spatial and temporal art form. That's a meaning of how the distance is created in the shot and the pacing of it. So on the movie screen, space and time are relative to each other. They can't separate them or perceive one without the other, so the two are one. Time with the space. So a little bit more complicated form here. As an example, we see really a model of a house on the edge of a cliff in The Gold Rush, 1925 Charlie Chaplin film. And as the movement's created in a special set, the tipping causes a change in camera perspective, like they're going over the side of the cliff. They go back to an exterior shot showing that shift in space and time, even though it's not real. They must match that inside the studio set. So they put the two together to make the two as one. A more extreme angle as the house is about to go over the cliff, more extreme on the studio shot, and that creates a sense of realism. In Donnie Darko, it's about a young man who's being communicated with by an unknown element, more science fiction or fantasy film, and they're using the images here to relate to the action he's taking, where in this scene he's actually going to set a house on fire. And you can see by the mood of the lights, a bright light there, more of a brownish earthy texture with red mixed in, the red of the gas can. All those colors will relate to making it more realistic, but it's an unrealistic act. And anti-realism is the part where Donnie is being communicated to by what some would call an alien. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. But that creates a different form of realism and anti-realism. And then being talked to by a giant rabbit is the anti-realism. It doesn't happen. But all these elements, implicit and explicit, will be brought out by the end of the movie. In news, you will see a scene from The Dark Knight that involves the Joker, Heath Ledger, the Batman, and Gordon. And all of those people come together with unique angles of the camera, creating a good and bad image. Of course, Joker's bad, Batman is debatable since he's creating violence in the scene, Gordon is the good. The camera movements become jarring and action-packed to create that. So when you get a moment, watch that scene and see what it's all about. In the end, this is the term that you want to remember, verisimilitude. It's the idea that what you're witnessing is the apparent truth, that you have to accept it because it's there in front of your face. You're watching it happen. So verisimilitude is the suggestion that you are accepting it as the truth, even though you know those people are not being hurt in reality. They are just acting. So remember that terms because in the end, they want you to feel like you are really there experiencing what is happening, and it will be reflected by the time it was done. The culture is presented to the audience in the expectation of what is real or accepted as real. Just like in this photo, a young woman in the portrait gives us a feeling that we can accept, that we can see the woman, we understand the image. We're in a more complex shot. This one is called Nude Ascending a Staircase. We must interpret it based on our own reality. And it's more convoluted. We don't understand it. You look at it, but you don't see it as a straightforward communication. The same is true in film. Realism from the Lumiere brothers from France in 1895. The reality of women working in a factory leaving to go home is very straightforward. We accept it because we understand it. In A Trip to the Moon by Georges Méliès, also in France in 1902, he creates the fantasy or anti-realism look with an actual space vehicle hitting the face of the moon, which in those days they considered the moon to have a man in the moon. So it's capturing how we felt about it, but it's not realistic. It's anti-realism, but we'll accept it to watch the story. So the cinematic language takes systems, different systems, methods, and conventions that we must accept or see as real that communicate to us, communicate to the viewer. The conventions are flexible, and as you learn the terms, you'll use film terms to show that from one to another there might be a dissolve or a straight cut, but it's always something that we have learned and accept. And the viewers will identify with the camera lens. We see that as the essential part of communicating. The lens captures the image. It makes us part of that image because we are witnessing it. So while it is presented to an audience, it still creates individual experiences that each person will determine what is their reality as depicted in the film. Some will accept it, some won't. That's kind of the true essence of film and why it's such a unique art form. So that's a look at Chapter 2. You're now ready for the first quiz, which will be over the first two chapters. And next time we will go into types of film or genres.